The envelope was yellowed with age, trembling in the hands of a woman who had carried it for 7 years. When 72-year-old Margaret Chen walked onto the Family Feud stage, nobody knew she held something that would stop the show cold. But what happened when she finally found the courage to give Steve Harvey that letter? It wasn't just television anymore. It was a moment that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The cameras were rolling on what seemed like a perfectly ordinary Tuesday afternoon taping at the Atlanta studios. Steve Harvey was in his element, working the crowd with that signature energy, that perfectly pressed navy suit catching the studio lights just right. The Chen family from San Francisco was facing off against the Williams family from Detroit, and everything was going exactly as planned. But Margaret Chen wasn't really there for the game. She sat at the edge of the family podium, clutching her small black purse with an intensity that made the production assistants take notice. Inside that purse was an envelope marked Steve Harvey in the careful handwriting of someone who had taken great care with every single letter. Margaret's family had no idea what she was carrying. Her son David, her daughter-in-law Lisa, her teenage granddaughter Sarah, they thought Grandma Margaret was just excited about being on television. They had no clue that 7 years ago she had made a promise to her dying daughter, a promise that had brought her 3,000 miles from California to this studio in Georgia. The game started normally enough. Steve cracked his usual jokes, the families gave their answers, the scoreboard lit up with points. The Chen family was doing well, holding their own against their competitors. But something about Margaret's silence bothered Steve. In 40 years of hosting, he developed an instinct about people who seemed to be carrying something heavy. During the commercial break, Steve noticed Margaret staring at him with tears in her eyes. Not tears of excitement or nerves. These were different. These were the tears of someone who had been waiting for this moment far too long. But what happened next shocked everyone in that studio, and it had nothing to do with the game. When the cameras came back on for the 4th round, Steve was asking the question, "Name something a mother does that shows she loves her family," when Margaret suddenly stood up from her seat. Her family looked confused. The audience turned to see what was happening. Steve paused mid-sentence. "Mrs. Chen," Steve said gently, "everything okay over there?" Margaret stepped forward, reaching into her purse with shaking hands. "Mr. Steve," she said, her voice barely audible over her wireless microphone, "I have something for you, something I promised I would give you." The studio fell quiet. Steve's comedian instincts told him to make a joke, to keep the energy light, but something about Margaret's expression stopped him. There was a gravity in her face that transcended entertainment. "What's that, sweetheart?" Steve asked, setting down his cards and giving her his full attention. Margaret pulled out the envelope. Even from a distance, everyone could see it was old, handled many times, precious. "This is from my daughter Amy," she said. "She wrote it for you 7 years ago before she—" Her voice broke. The audience held its breath, but nobody was prepared for what Steve did next, and what was in that letter would change everything he thought he knew about his impact on people's lives. Steve Harvey had hosted thousands of hours of television. He'd seen emotional moments, heartbreak, joy, surprise, every human emotion played out under bright lights. But something about the way Margaret held that envelope, the way her hands trembled, the way she looked at him like she was about to deliver a message from beyond, it stopped him cold. "Before she what, Mrs. Chen?" Steve asked softly, his voice now stripped of all performance. "Before she lost her battle with cancer," Margaret whispered, and the words carried across the silent studio like a prayer. Steve's expression changed completely. The entertainer mask fell away, and suddenly he was just a man looking at a mother's grief. He walked down from his podium, something he rarely did during active gameplay, and approached Margaret. She was 34, Margaret continued, tears now flowing freely. Single mom, working 2 jobs, raising my granddaughter Sarah all by herself. And every day after her chemotherapy, she would come home and watch Family Feud. She said you were the only one who could make her laugh when everything hurt. The cameras kept rolling, but the production team had stopped checking their watches, stopped worrying about timing. They were witnessing something that transcended television. Steve reached Margaret and gently took the envelope from her hands. "She wrote this for me?" he asked. "2 weeks before she died." Margaret nodded. She was so weak she could barely hold a pen, but she insisted. She said, "Mom, promise me you'll get this to Mr. Steve Harvey somehow. Promise me." Behind the scenes, producers were frantically trying to figure out what to do. This wasn't part of any script. This was raw, unfiltered human emotion happening in real time. Steve looked at the envelope in his hands. Written in fading blue ink was for Mr. Steve Harvey, from Amy Chen and Sarah. The handwriting was shaky, clearly written by someone who was very ill, but every letter had been formed with care. "Would you like me to read it now?" Steve asked Margaret. "She wanted you to read it on television," Margaret said. She said maybe it would help other people know how much they mean to families like ours. Steve Harvey had opened thousands of letters from fans over his career, but as he carefully unsealed this envelope, his hands were shaking. Inside was a single sheet of paper, covered in that same careful handwriting. The studio was so quiet you could hear the air conditioning humming. 300 people held their breath. The competing families had abandoned their game stance and were simply watching this moment unfold. Steve unfolded the letter and began to read silently. Within seconds, his face crumpled. He tried to maintain composure, tried to be professional, but whatever was written on that paper hit him like a physical blow. "Oh my God," he whispered, his voice breaking. But what happened next proved that some moments are bigger than television, bigger than entertainment, bigger than anything a script could ever capture. Steve tried to read the letter aloud, but the words caught in his throat. He cleared his throat, tried again, and managed to get out the first few lines before emotion overwhelmed him completely.
"Dear Mr. Steve Harvey," he began, his voice thick with tears. "My name is Amy Chen, and this is my daughter Sarah. We watch your show every single day, and you probably don't know this, but you've been taking care of us for months."
Steve had to stop. The weight of those words, the responsibility he never knew he carried, hit him all at once. He looked up at Margaret, then at Sarah, the teenage granddaughter who was now crying herself. "You want to know what else she wrote?" Steve asked the studio, his voice growing stronger as he understood the importance of sharing this message. The audience nodded collectively, understanding they were part of something sacred. Steve continued reading. "When the cancer got bad and I couldn't work anymore, when Sarah and I were scared about money and medicine and what would happen to her if I didn't make it, we would turn on Family Feud. For 30 minutes we could forget about being afraid. For 30 minutes we could laugh together. You gave us something we couldn't give ourselves anymore: joy." The silence in the studio was deafening. Several audience members were openly crying. Even the camera operators had tears in their eyes. But Steve wasn't finished reading, and what came next would stay with him for the rest of his life. Steve's hands were shaking as he continued with Amy's letter. "Mr. Harvey," he read, "I need you to know that every time you made us laugh, you were doing more than entertaining us. You were giving us hope. You were reminding us that even when life gets really hard, there's still room for happiness." He paused, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. The studio lights felt too bright, the silence too heavy. "But here's the thing I really need you to understand," Steve continued reading. "It wasn't just the jokes. It was the way you treated families with kindness. The way you hugged people when they were nervous. The way you made everyone feel like they mattered. Sarah and I would watch you, and I would think, that's the kind of man I want my daughter to know exists in the world. Margaret stepped closer to Steve, her own tears falling freely. She made me promise to tell you that you weren't just a host to our family. You were like a daily visit from someone who cared about us. Steve looked up from the letter and did something unprecedented in all his years of hosting. He walked to the center of the stage and called for the studio lights to be raised so he could see every face in the audience. I need everyone here to understand something, Steve announced, his voice carrying a gravity that silenced any remaining whispers. This letter isn't just about one family. This is about every family that invites us into their living room every day. This is about the responsibility we have to be better than just entertainment. But the most powerful moment was still coming, and what Steve did next broke every rule in television. Steve folded the letter carefully and placed it in his jacket pocket, right over his heart. Then he began removing his suit jacket, the expensive navy blazer that was part of his television persona, his armor of success. "Margaret," he said, walking back to her, "your daughter Amy gave me something more valuable than any Emmy, any rating, any review. She gave me purpose. She reminded me why I do this." He draped his jacket around Margaret's shoulders, and the symbolism was clear to everyone watching. This wasn't a game show host making a gesture for the cameras. This was a man honoring a family that had honored him. "This jacket has been with me through hundreds of shows," Steve said, his voice growing stronger as he found his message. "It's been part of the laughter, part of the celebration, part of all the joy we create here. But today it belongs with Amy's family because they understood something that I'm just now learning." The audience was completely silent, hanging on every word. They understood that what we do here isn't really about money or prizes or winning games. It's about connection. It's about looking at each other and saying, "You matter. Your family matters. Your struggles matter. And even when life gets hard, you're not alone." Steve turned to address the cameras directly, speaking to the millions who would eventually see this moment. "Amy Chen, wherever you are, I want you to know that your letter didn't just reach me. It's going to reach everyone watching this. Because what you taught me is that we're all in this together. We're all just families trying to make each other laugh, trying to take care of each other, trying to find joy even when it's hard to find." But what happened next showed the true measure of who Steve Harvey really is. Steve reached into his pocket and pulled out his personal business card. But instead of giving it to Margaret, he held it up to the camera. "Sarah," he said, looking directly into the lens, "I know you're watching this someday. This card has my personal number on it. Not for interviews, not for publicity. This is for you. Because your mom asked me to look out for you, and I take promises from mothers very seriously." The teenage Sarah, standing beside her grandmother, broke down completely. The weight of knowing that her mother's final wish had been fulfilled, that this man her mother admired had heard her words and understood their love, it was overwhelming. Steve walked over to Sarah and without hesitation pulled her into a hug. Not a brief, camera-friendly embrace, but the kind of hug a father gives a daughter who needs to know she's protected. "Your mama was right," he whispered to Sarah, loud enough for the microphones to pick up. "There are good people in the world, and you're never gonna be alone. You understand me?" Sarah nodded through her tears, and Steve turned back to the audience. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "we're gonna do something different today. Both families are going to win the maximum prize because today isn't about competition. Today is about family. Today is about understanding that love doesn't end just because someone isn't here anymore." The applause that followed lasted over 3 minutes. But more importantly, something had shifted in that studio. Everyone present understood they had witnessed something larger than entertainment. They had seen love transcend death, seen connection bridge the gap between strangers, seen the true power of treating each other with dignity and care. The episode, when it aired months later, became the most watched Family Feud episode in the show's history. Not because of drama or controversy, but because viewers recognized something authentic in a world that often feels manufactured. But the real impact happened off-camera. Steve Harvey's foundation established the Amy Chen Memorial Fund, providing support for families dealing with terminal illness. Margaret Chen became a regular speaker at the foundation's events, sharing her daughter's story and reading portions of the letter to audiences across the country. Sarah Chen graduated high school as valedictorian and received a full scholarship to Stanford University, a scholarship quietly funded by Steve's foundation. At her graduation, she wore Margaret's jacket, the one Steve had given her grandmother that day. And Steve Harvey, he had Amy's letter framed in his office, not as a trophy, but as a reminder that the work he does reaches far beyond entertainment, that families invite him into their homes during their hardest moments, and that with that invitation comes a sacred responsibility to bring joy, hope, and dignity to every interaction. Years later, in interviews, Steve would say that Amy's letter changed how he approached every show. "I realized that day that I'm not just hosting a game show," he would explain. "I'm visiting families. I'm sitting in people's living rooms during their chemotherapy, their grief, their struggles. That's not entertainment, that's ministry." The letter still sits in Steve's office today, a reminder that sometimes the most powerful messages come from the most unexpected places, and that the true measure of success isn't how much you can make people laugh, it's how much hope you can give them when laughter is the hardest thing in the world to find. Margaret Chen kept Steve's jacket until her own death 5 years later. In her will, she left it to Sarah with a note. "This jacket represents the promise that good people will always look out for you. Wear it when you need to remember that you're loved." And somewhere, in a framed letter in a television studio office, Amy Chen's words continue to remind one of America's most beloved entertainers that the greatest gift you can give another human being isn't laughter, it's the reminder that they matter, that their pain is seen, and that even in their darkest moments, they are not alone. Share the story, make sure it's never forgotten, because in a world that often feels divided and cold, we need to remember that connection is possible, that love transcends death, and that sometimes a simple letter can change everything, including the heart of a man who thought he was just there to make people laugh.